In this lesson, we'll continue our discussion of the chemical level of organization by taking a look at organic chemistry. We're going to see that organic chemistry involves four important biomolecules. We're going to take a look at carbohydrates. That's the focus of this lesson. We'll then take a look at lipids. We'll take a look at proteins, and we'll finish up by looking at nucleic acids. So these are our important biomolecules. Like I said, carbohydrates, we're going to see those are sugars. Lipids include fats, proteins, and then we'll take a look at nucleic acids, which are DNA and RNA. Now, our biomolecules are very large molecules. If you ever look at them, you're going to see they're huge. So we can also call them macromolecules, where macro means big. These macromolecules are made up of, think of them as building blocks. If we connect a bunch of building blocks together, we form this huge molecule. The building blocks in biochemistry we call monomers, right? So mono meaning individual or one building block or subunit. So we could take these monomers, connect them together, and build a much larger structure. That larger structure we would call a polymer. All right, so many times, just as an example, you don't have to write this down now. We could take identical monomers, such as, let's say, glucose. You may know that glucose is a sugar. If I took a bunch of glucoses and I just connected them together, I end up forming this big structure. In plants, you would know it as starch. In humans, a bunch of glucoses connect together is glycogen. Okay, so the monomer would be the individual glucose, and then the polymer would be the starch in plants or the glycogen in humans. Right, so many of these large organic molecules are made up of long chains of carbons. Wait till you see these pictures of these. You'll see they're just long chains of carbon. And we know from previous lessons that the bonds between carbons are covalent bonds, which involves the sharing of electrons. Okay, so this is an important introduction slide. The four biomolecules you need to know are carbohydrates, sugars, lipids, which include fats, proteins, and nucleic acids, right? DNA and RNA. These are large structures, so we can call them macromolecules, and they're made up of building blocks known as monomers. And when these monomers join together, we call that a polymer. And we're going to see predominantly carbon is going to be in these organic molecules, and they're covalently bonded. However, in addition to carbon, we also have hydrogen and oxygen. So as you look at carbs, as you look at lipids and proteins and DNA and RNA, you're going to see carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There are some other atoms. We'll see, like in proteins, nitrogen, right? You could see in some other structures, different proteins, you could even see sulfur. But the ones we're going to be working with mostly this semester are going to be carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And again, all of these atoms, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, they bond together by covalent bonding, right, which is the sharing of electrons. Now, our organic molecules have different functional groups to help determine their chemical chemistry and their chemical properties. For instance, you've probably heard of amino acids. We're going to see these are the building blocks of proteins. Amino acids have a special functional group known as an amino group, which is a nitrogen bonded to two hydrogens. Let's check it out. So here's the amino group, NH2. So take a look here. N is nitrogen, 1, 2 hydrogens. These two hydrogens are covalently bonded to the nitrogen. This R now represents the rest of the molecule. This could be just like one carbon or a chain of carbons. It could just be different structures here or different elements or atoms. So that just represents the rest of the molecule. Don't worry about this importance here. This is a little bit advanced for us right now. just know that the place we would find an amino group, as an example, would be an amino acid, right? So NH2. The next functional group that we're going to see, and this one we're going to see a lot, is known as a carboxyl group. This represents an organic acid. So watch this. Carboxyl groups are found in amino acids and fatty acids, right? So carboxyl group is something we see in an organic acid. So what does it look like? Right, this is going to be a C with a double bond oxygen and then a OH. So take a look here. Here's our carbon, double bonded to an oxygen, and then going up here, OH, right? So I usually say C double bond O, OH, right? This right here would be the carboxyl group. Then this is the rest of the molecule, the rest of the whatever the structure is, fatty acid or amino acid, that type of thing. So that's where we find them, fatty acids and amino acids. While we're on the slide, we'll stay here. An OH group is what we call a hydroxyl group. Right? These we see in all three carbs. We see them on fatty acids. We see them on amino acids. I'll point them out to you as we do those structures. And then the last one we're going to see is a phosphate group, PO4, right? Of phosphorus with 4 oxygens. P, 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, don't worry about this middle column right now. This is a little bit advanced for us at this level. Phosphorus or phosphate groups are important as part of phospholipids, which is an important part of our cell membranes. We find them in DNA and RNA, and we also find them in high energy compounds. ATP would be an example, adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so hydroxyl group is the OH. It's found, like I said, in amino acids, fatty acids, we're going to see them in carbs, and then phosphate group, PO4, nucleic acids, RNA, DNA, ATP. On the table before, they had phospholipids, which are parts of our cell membrane. We'll look at that when we get to the cell level of life. Okay, so these are all important functional groups. So now that we have some of that background down, let's take a look at our first group of biomolecules. We'll take a look at carbohydrates. So carbohydrates contain those 3 atoms we mentioned before, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, they have them in a specific ratio. You're going to see for every 1 carbon, there is 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So it's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So I like to write it this way. For 1 carbon, there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. We don't have to write the 1 next to carbon or oxygen. It's just assumed. But notice this, guys. C with 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, and an oxygen. Look what I did. I bracketed out the hydrogen and the oxygen. So this looks like the molecule water. And this is how they get the name carbohydrate, right? What does hydro mean? Water. I always wondered, how does carbohydrate mean sugar, right? It's this. It's a carbon with a water. Okay. Again, I did this. The brackets. You're not going to see that in a book or anything like that. But just to help kind of understand. C, right? 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen, and if I bracket this out, I get my carbohydrate. Now we're going to see carbohydrates are one of the more important energy sources. We're going to actually burn carbohydrates to make ATP. Now, some carbohydrates we're going to see are isomers of one another. And what that means is they have the same formula, but they look different. And this is the example I always like to give in class. Right? If we had a class and I said to half the class on one side of the room, I'm going to give you the lumber to build a house. Everything you need, lumber and roofing, anything that you need to build a house. We're going to give you every material to build the house. Then the other half of the room, I'm going to give them the same exact amount of material, no different. And then each half of the class is going to build a house. Let's say the group on the left builds a beautiful ranch with the materials that they have. The group on the right side of the room, let's say, builds a cape with the same amount of materials, right? So both houses are built with the same amount of material, but the houses look different, right? One's a ranch, the other one is a cape. Those houses we would consider isomers of one another. So in an example for carbohydrates, if I took glucose, which has the formula C6 H12O6. Remember, for every one carbon, there's two hydrogens, so we have to double the hydrogens, and then one oxygen, right? So it's C6 H12O6. That's the formula for glucose. But fructose, which is fruit sugar, has the same formula, C6 H12O6, right? So they have the same formula. But if you look at a picture of them, you'll see they are built differently. So glucose and fructose are isomers of one another. Same thing, if I took galactose, that is also an isomer of glucose. So that means it has the same formula as glucose. It just looks different. So we can divide carbohydrates into three different categories. We're going to look at monosaccharides, disaccharides, and then we'll finish looking at polysaccharides. Monosaccharides are what we call simple sugars, right? They contain anywhere from 3 to 7 carbon atoms. So just as an example to name them, a 3-carbon sugar we can consider a triose, right? Tri meaning 3. A 4-carbon sugar would be a tetrose. A 5-carbon sugar, penta is 5, so that would be a pentose. These we're going to see when we do DNA and RNA. And then hexoses are going to be 6-carbon sugars. And the three that we're going to look at are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Galactose we're going to see is actually a part of milk sugar. All right, so monosaccharides are just individual carbohydrates. So we call them simple, right? Mono meaning one. There's different types. There can be anywhere from 3 to 7 carbons in a sugar. The 3 and the 4 we're not going to really do too much with this semester. I think I'll show you one example of a 3-carbon sugar. We won't do any tetroses. We won't see any of that. But we will see pentoses and hexoses, right? The pentose we're going to see this semester is called ribose. Again, you don't have to write that down now. We'll talk about that later. But these are important. The 6-carbon sugars, the ones we're going to look at again, are glucose, which is an important fuel, as I mentioned before. Fructose is the sugar we see in fruit. And then galactose, we're going to see, is going to be part of milk sugar, right? That goes into milk sugar. So since glucose is so important to us, I just figured I'd show you a picture of it. If you counted up all these carbons here, you would find 6 of them. If you counted up all the hydrogens, you would see 12 of them, and then 6 oxygens. So notice sugar has these OH groups. Remember we said that hydroxyl groups are on carbohydrates. So there they are right there. So this is going to be C6H12O6. But in nature, glucose doesn't really exist in this form, in a like a branched form like this. It actually is in a ring form like this. So here we just took this straight chain and we bent it and we bonded it together to form a ring. Here's our first carbon here. This carbon here that I'm pointing to right now is actually that carbon up over here. This is carbon number 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 is over here. And then oxygen is binding together the first and the fifth. So this is actually a ring. This is the way glucose actually exists predominantly in nature. Okay, so that's just a straight chain form, and this is the ring form, right? The most common form of glucose. Now, If we take two monosaccharides and we bond them together, we now end up with a disaccharide. However, the chemical process, we studied this in a previous lesson, that binds two carbohydrates together is known as dehydration synthesis. Remember from a previous lesson, this is the removal of a water, right? H2O, dehydration. So we're going to see that sucrose, which is table sugar, is produced by the dehydration synthesis of a glucose and a fructose, right? So these are the two monomers. If we bond them together, we form table sugar, right? So any sugar you have at home that's table sugar is actually called sucrose, and that was made by a glucose and a fructose coming together. If we just took two glucoses and put them together, that we call maltose, right? They actually call that malt sugar. Then if we take a glucose and a galactose, that produces something you may have heard called lactose. This is milk sugar. So if you notice, guys, in sucrose, maltose, and lactose, what's common to each one? Each one has at least one glucose. Right, so I kind of listed it that way on purpose, right? So you can see each one has one glucose. Then the other is going to be different for the most part, right? So glucose and fructose is sucrose, right? Two glucoses make maltose, and then again a glucose and a galactose make lactose. So let's take a look at this dehydration synthesis. In previous lessons, we only mentioned it. Let me show you exactly what I mean, right? So don't get intimidated by this chemistry here. It's very simple, actually. Watch this. If you recognize here, this structure on the left was a glucose. This structure here is an isomer of glucose known as fructose. Right? If you counted up all the carbons and hydrogens and oxygen, you would have the same amount in this structure as you do in this structure. So they're isomers of one another. But if we're going to combine them, we're going to take, watch this hydroxyl group off of glucose, OH, and then this hydrogen off of fructose. So check this out, H2O. We take this water molecule out here, we'll remove it, right? We're going to bring it and we're just going to put it over there. Now we're going to get a bond between the carbon here, this carbon, and in the middle is going to be this oxygen. So if you take a look over here now, I joined together the glucose and the fructose, and we form this bond right over here. You don't have to know this, but this is called a glycosidic bond for anybody that may have taken organic chemistry already. Right? We call this a glycosidic bond. And now we have a new structure with totally different chemical processes, chemical properties, excuse me. This is known as sucrose, right? This is table sugar. Okay, and again, this chemical reaction was dehydration synthesis, right? So when we remove that water from these two reactants over here to make a new product, there's the water. Now, just to show you guys just the reverse, if I took the sucrose and added the water back in, we break that glycosidic bond. The OH goes back onto glucose, the hydrogen goes back onto fructose, and now we separated this. The adding of water back in, we also talked about this in a previous lesson, is known as hydrolysis. Hydro meaning water, and lysis meaning to break down. So when you consume sugar in your digestive system, water is added along with an enzyme to break down the sucrose into glucose and to fructose, right? So these are actually just the opposite. Dehydration synthesis made sucrose, hydrolysis broke down sucrose, right? Dehydration synthesis, we removed the water. In hydrolysis, we added the water back. Okay, so that's a good representation of the dehydration synthesis. The last category of carbohydrates we want to look at are what we call polysaccharides. These are many simple sugars combine together to form this really large structure known as a polysaccharide. So these are polymers of many sugars condensed by dehydration synthesis. So same thing, as we add all these sugars together, these simple sugars, each time we add a simple sugar, we have to do dehydration synthesis. So there's two types of polysaccharides that I want you to be familiar with. In human anatomy, the important one is going to be called glycogen, right? So this is our stored form of glucose. It's only in humans for our purposes, and we store it in two places. We store it in our liver, and we also store it in skeletal muscle. In future lessons, I'll actually show you how we can actually use the glycogen to produce energy inside of our muscles, right? So we'll go back to that later in the semester. Polysaccharides in plants are going to be starch and cellulose, right? So starch is equivalent to glycogen, right? Starch and glycogen are the same thing, except that glycogen is found in humans. Starch is found in plants. Cellulose is what gives a plant its structure. It forms like the roots, the stem, the leaves, and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of interesting. Cellulose, if we consume it as humans, we don't have enzymes to really break down the cellulose. So this is what provides roughage inside of our diet. You could think of it as fiber, okay, which is important to colon health. So let's take a look. So check this out. Over here, this is glycogen. Look at glycogen. It's just all these little circles here. Each circle represents a glucose. So see how they're all bonded together. So here what they did was they took this just section of glycogen and expanded it out. So now you can see, you should be able to recognize, right, this ring right here is a glucose. So you'll see there's these glucoses all bonded together, and it's just this big branching structure. And so that's what glycogen looks like. And just look how big this branching structure is. So this is our last slide for this lesson. At the end of each biomolecule, there's a little summary table which kind of just puts things together. So you'll see here's like a summary of the carbohydrates. So we know we have our monosaccharides, the disaccharides, and the polysaccharides, some examples of each, some of their functions, and just a little bit more information. Okay, so that concludes this lesson on just an introduction to organic chemistry and carbohydrates.